everybody. Welcome back. We are starting chapter 14 this week. So this is all about the brain, which is the most mysterious part of human anatomy and physiology, I think. There's still a lot of unknowns about the brain, but we will be learning about what is known so far, and maybe a couple of those unanswered questions will show up throughout this chapter. So this little mini lesson is just an introduction to the general organization of the brain. And embryology, which is the development of the brain, how it changes in fetal development. So about 98% of all of our neural tissue is found in the brain. So all the stuff that we looked at already with the spinal cord and the peripheral nerves, all your spinal nerve or your nerve list, only about 2% of all neural tissue in the body is found in the spinal cord and peripheral nerves. The rest of it is found in the brain, 98%. That's a lot. Okay, so when we take a look at the brain itself, it is broken up into kind of four major areas, and that's how I'm going to be presenting them in the other mini lessons. So this will just be an introduction to how they are. I am going to talk about them from the bottom up because that's the path of which I'm going to cover them in the subsequent lectures. So the most inferior part of the brain is what we call the brain stem, and it is made up of smaller subunits. So of the brainstem, the most inferior part of the brainstem is what we call the medulla oblongata. It is continuous with the spinal cord. And then sitting just above that is what we call the pons. And then just above that is what we call the mesencephalon, or I think the newer editions are calling it the brain, midbrain, which is fine. Mesencephalon, midbrain, that's fine. So those are the three components of the brainstem: medulla oblongata, pons, and the midbrain. The next structure is the cerebellum. That's kind of colored blue in this diagram. The cerebellum means little brain, sits back here on the posterior region of the skull. And so we'll get to that. The next, or the third section, is what's called the diencephalon, which is that kind of pink, eggy looking shape sitting on top of the brainstem. And it has some subcategories as well, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and we'll talk a little bit about a region called the epithalamus. So that's your diencephalon. And then the largest part of our brain is the cerebrum, which we'll talk about last because that has all the fun conscious stuff to it. Everything else, the cerebellum, the brainstem, the diencephalon, all of those work with functions that are below our conscious awareness. It is the cerebrum that allows us to be aware of things and control things. So a couple other things I wanted to point out in this diagram are just some new vocabulary words that are associated with the structure of the brain. You might recognize that the brain is wrinkly. Those wrinkles have special names. They're called gyri. Okay. Or gyrus for singular. So it's the ridges. And then little grooves in between are called sulci, or singular is sulcus. So if you hear me say gyrus or sulcus, it's just singular for gyri or sulci. There are also deeper fissures that are kind of bigger dividing wrinkles, if you will, between other gyri and sulci. And then also in our cerebrum and our cerebellum, we have what are called hemispheres. Those are halves. So in this particular picture, we're only seeing the left cerebral hemisphere, but know that your brain kind of sits like this in your skull, right? So you have your right hemisphere and you have your left hemisphere. There's a big longitudinal fissure that comes through and separates your left and right that we'll see in pictures later on when we talk more in depth about the cerebrum. Okay. All right, so those are the major regions. You can see the little descriptions in the boxes, but when we get to the mini lessons on each of those areas, we're going to talk way more in depth as to what they do more specifically. Okay, and then the last little bit of information in this mini lesson is just the embryology of the brain, showing you how it develops from early gestation to the regions at birth that we just talked about. So they start with a 3-week brain, and it really is just a tube. Even before 3 weeks, it starts off as what's called a neural tube. The cells that are differentiating in that fertilized egg, mitosis, 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 you get all these clusters of cells, and then they start to differentiate. And one of the earliest differentiations is this neural tube, which is what we call the primary brain vesicles. So we can see this tube is kind of getting swollen in certain regions. It's differentiating a little bit. So the three regions of a 3-week-old brain are the prosencephalon, the mesencephalon, and the rhombencephalon. And then that tan part on the bottom is just going to continue to become the spinal cord. And if you remember, we had in the spinal cord, we talked about the central canal, that hollow space. That's where it comes from, because all of the central nervous system is this tube with neural tissue around it, and then this hollow tube. So that central canal in the spinal cord is just a remnant of that hollow space in this very early neural tube. All right, so then about 3 weeks later, there's further differentiation. There's some changes in the neuron development, in programming of what those neurons are going to be. So about 3 weeks later, at week 6 of gestation, we have what are called secondary brain vesicles. So we have a little bit of divergence here. So the prosencephalon splits into 2 regions, which are called the telencephalon and the diencephalon. So that's the yellow and the purpley pink. They're trying to color code with the adult brain that we just saw. The mesencephalon stays mesencephalon. The rhombencephalon diverges into the metencephalon and the myelencephalon. Again, these are just words that are used in the 6-week stage, okay? Then the rest, so that's 6 weeks out of 9 months. So those further develop, growing into the brain of what we typically recognize as a brain. And then those 6-week vesicles are now the brain regions that we just talked about at birth. So the telencephalon is now the cerebellum. The diencephalon is still the diencephalon. Mesencephalon stays mesencephalon. We now call it the midbrain. The metencephalon becomes the cerebellum and the pons, and the myelencephalon transitions into the medulla oblongata. So those are all that, this column here are all the regions we just got done looking at in the adult brain, which are present at birth. They grow a lot in the first couple years of life, and they continue to develop through the rest of your life, but they are there at birth. And then we take a look at what are called ventricles, which we're going to see in a future mini lesson talking about the ventricles and the meninges. So the ventricles in the brain are hollow spaces, which are, again, the remnants of that hole in the middle of this neural tube. So we have lateral ventricles, third ventricles, connectors called aqueducts, and fourth ventricles. So we're going to see all those a little bit later. But this kind of shows you where they all started from, was this hollow tube that just changed and progressed and developed and differentiated through the whole 9 months of gestation to give you a fully functional brain by the time you're born. Okay, so that wraps up this introductory lesson. I will see you next time when we start diving into some of the protective structures that help to protect the brain. Okay, bye.